And we start with Mohamed Khalaph. So may I ask you, please, Mohamed? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Mohamed Khalaph, again, he was with both of us, I gave something on anthropology and Tayeb Salih, and you gave something. But this is the second time Mohamed Khalaph can give something on Tayeb Salih. Mohamed is a writer and critic. He's based in the United Kingdom and widely recognized as a rigorous and insightful work in cultural studies and literary criticism. He has authored many prolific collection of essays published in newspaper, online platform, and peer-reviewed journals. His first book, the open novelistic corpus, The Art of Narrative Storytelling in a Tayeb Salih work, consolidates his research and critical perspective on Sudanese literature. المتن الروائي المفتوح في القص السردي عند الطيب صالح. This is his latest work on the Tayeb Salih. We're very grateful to have him with us. So I give you the platform, Mohamed.
Thank you, Ahmed.
Not at all. Yeah, well,
Thank you, Laurent. At first, I sort of giving a verbal delivery of this paper. But on second thoughts, I realized that reading, albeit is going to be very fast and very short, but it's going to consolidate the main thesis of the paper. That is to say, the skill of reading. The title of the paper is Mustafa Sa'eed and Mansi, How the British Fragmented Acquisition of the English Language to Consolidate their Imperial Rule in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. After reading the French translation of Season of Migration to the North, which appeared with a generous introduction by the Arabist Jacques Behr of the prestigious Collège de France, the French novelist François Moya, a member of the equally prestigious Académie Française, said, and I quote, "We have never read anything like this before. We who have read everything." D'accord, Monsieur Moya. Then what does the first person plural pronoun here refer to? Does it refer to the Europeans who would be speaking German had it been for US intervention, as Donald Trump had once joked? Or does it refer to the French people whose language would be spoken in the US if it wasn't for the Brits, as King Charles has recently quipped in retort? We, the Sudanese, on our part, still speak both in the literal and the figurative sense in different tongues, despite the long stay of British colonialists in our country. The reason for that is because the British administration in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan had fragmented acquisition of their own language, not by design, mind you, but by necessity. The Sudan Political Service, SPS, during the condominium period, 1899-1955, in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, had no more than a few hundred British and Egyptian staff. They desperately needed a Sudanese guard to give them a direly needed helping hand. The policy of cooperation with native leaders had helped SPS create stable local governments. But those native notables were mainly illiterate. They could help in managing their local communities, but they were useless in running a modern state. So the British administration needed to educate the young to undertake that task. The problem facing SPS in that endeavor was the process of educating young Sudanese could take a long time. There was already an education system in place for teaching the skills of reading and writing in Arabic in Quranic schools, locally known as Khalawis. To start teaching English for the young, it had to be in the intermediate stage. Even then, there were no feasible way to teach all the English language for skills. That is, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So, SPS opted for fragmenting acquisition of these skills. They chose to teach native Sudanese pupils English language with much emphasis on reading at the expense of writing, while doing away altogether with both listening and speaking. Their chosen syllables was Michael West's New Methods Reading, from Reader 1 to Reader 6. Mr. West was a colonial educator working in a training college in Dhaka, East Bengal, now Bangladesh. As colonialism being a truly global venture, expertise gained in one colony could easily be transferred to another. Mr. West's method of teaching English applied in schools at one colonial state was adopted across the board. In Sudan, it was practiced by Bakhtaruda Teaching Institute, where Tayeb Salih himself worked before finding a lucrative job at the BBC in London. But the situation in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan was starkly different from any other colony. The state in condominium Sudan was sharply divided. Its classical power, symbolized by a strong army, was not fully held, but earnestly fought after the British, while its ideological arm, epitomized by the institution of education, was by necessity left to the Egyptians. The British rulers were desperate to fill the newly established school classrooms with native boys whose parents were understandably resisting the kind of education imposed by colonialists. Ultimately, when the British campaigners succeeded in their efforts, the chosen boys would be instructed by Egyptian educators. Mustafa Sa'eed was brought to school by a man on a horseback wearing a hat, but taken to a classroom supervised by a man wearing gibba. Obviously, the contrast in costume could be interpreted as referring to a deeper one in connection with controlling the ideological space in the classroom. At first glance, the world of the novel, any novel, seems like a closed space. The main characters have already said their pieces. The plots have become finished articles, and the writers have put paid to any further chances of altering their fictional works. Yet, literary works are frequently full of traces that hint at opening up their spaces to perceptive readers. That means any potential reader, because each and everyone of us is naturally equipped with an individual perspective that allows her to open the text along these traces in a truly unique way. But the traces mentioned here are unlike the conception of slippage or continually referred meanings of single linguistic signs elaborated by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Traces, in the sense employed here, are nearer to the naturalistic meaning, in that they contain a considerable amount of information that can be tapped in by any reader. On his part, Tayeb Salih, in Season of Migration to the North, does not leave a haphazard collection of unevenly scattered traces. Instead, he provides his prospective readers with a nicely arranged pattern of multi-layered traces. These traces, which are built into season, could be classified into three categories: internal, surface, and external traces. The internal ones are those material traces provided by Mustafa Sa'eed, the main protagonist, to be looked into and eventually unmasked by his alter ego, the principal narrator. It includes a wartime poem from World War I, recited by Mustafa Sa'eed when he was visibly drunk in a drinking session at Mahjoub's house. B, a bundle of documents, including a birth certificate and multiply stamped passports. And C, a closed room built with red bricks and having a distinctive sloping roof. At first, the narrator's interest was piqued by the incident of the poem's recitation, and his curiosity was heightened to the utmost level imaginable. In addition, he was left with the key to that unusual room, and he was conveniently entrusted with the tutelage of Mustafa Sa'eed's two sons, Osman and Sa'eed, and by extension, their widowed mother, Husna Mahmoud. That leaves the number with no option. That leaves the narrator with no option but to focus his deep thoughts on revealing the true nature of Mustafa's character, a stranger who chose to live in an obscure village at the bend of the Nile in northern Sudan. The surface traces, on the other hand, are related to the discourses of the protagonist, seen against the background of what various characters in the novel think about him, especially the narrator himself, who acts as his mirror image, and to a greater degree to minor characters such as the retired Mamua, without whose intervention a lot of Mustafa's biography would be lost in translation, while guesses, sheer lies, and unjustified speculation, notwithstanding the unfair judgments, biases, and innuendos leveled by the retired official himself as the main protagonist. Lastly, external traces refer to the actual history of the Salih homeland, as well as the intertextual relations his famous novel has with regional and international novels produced by eminent novelists before him. In this paper, we focus our attention on the retired Mamua's account and his not favorable judgment on Mustafa Sa'eed. Besides taking a glimpse about the actual history of the Sudan during the condominium era and comparing it with some of the facts that have been employed in the novel. Tayeb Salih wanted his protagonist, Mustafa Sa'eed, to deliver a strong but nuanced message against colonialism. He knew that if the message was delivered verbally to the colonial administration at Khartoum, it would be ignored. And if in writing, the message should be kept on file or thrown in the bin. The SPS, that is the British administration at Khartoum, had shut its colonial staff within closed chambers, and the native staff were reduced to working as junior clerks at the bottom end of the bureaucratic machinery of the state. So the eminent Sudanese novelist chose to rush his main character through educational system. He let him spend 2 years in primary school, 3 years in intermediate school, and 3 years in secondary schools in Egypt. By the age of 15, Mustafa Sa'eed had become an articulate intellectual right at the gate of the colonial metropolis, strategically primed, while at the same time positioning himself at the ready to wage his personal war against the establishment of imperialism. Mustafa Sa'eed is purposefully made by the novelist a highly selective warrior. He knows his audience in detail. Namely, they are retired civil servants who had worked in the East, all women whose husband had died in Egypt, Iraq, and Sudan, men who had fought with Kitchener and Allenby, Orientalists, an official in the colonial office, and the Middle East section of the Foreign Office. Furthermore, the condominium state at Khartoum was actually a double-headed monster, Britain and Egypt. You need to cooperate with one side to blindside the other, or trick one head to bypass the other. So, by delivering the message from a distant place, Mustafa Sa'eed would bypass them both, facing Orientalism, colonialism in its own backyard. It is equally true that the protagonist is diverted by the allurement of life in the metropolis and started to move by the logic of the plot itself rather than the writer's main objective. Mustafa Sa'eed chooses instead to move in bohemian circles, uses empty rhetorics in his lectures, seduces poor girls, and by lies and hackneyed phrases, tries his hand to promote a discipline of economics built on love rather than figures. Mustafa Sa'eed's mastery of the English language has given him a rare weapon in delivering an effective message against colonialism, but wasted in pursuit of knightly gains. I quote, "By day, I lived with a series of canes and Tony," he said about himself. "And at night, I resumed the war with bow and sword and spear and arrows." The aim of Mustafa Sa'eed is hugely squandered in hot air and clownish behavior, but the position from which he delivered his message is hugely preserved. And this is precisely what endeared Tayeb Salih and his famous protagonists to the likes of Edward Said and to the writers and academics engaged in post-colonial studies and anti-imperial discourse. Nearly finished. Yes, sir. Mustafa Sa'eed may be said to have covered his pre-university education in a single bound, and his proficiency in English come natural to him. But the same thing cannot be said about the method of teaching English intermediate school in Sudan, where the fragmentation of acquisition of language skills have left the majority of school pupils at a great educational disadvantage. In talking about Mustafa Sa'eed, the retired Memoir said, "The tone," and this is very important, the tone in which the masters addressed him was different from that in which they taught us, especially the English teachers. It was as though they were giving the lesson to him alone and excluding the rest of the students. The retired Mamua significantly said, we used to articulate English words as though they were Arabic and were unable to pronounce two consonants together without putting a vowel in between. Whereas Mustafa Sa'eed would contort his mouth and thrust out his lips, and the words would issue forth as though from the mouth of one of those mother tongue it was. Sorry, but this is crafted by the translator, and his name is the famous Dennis Johnson Davis. Wonderful translation. In Season of Migration to the North, the writer creates a fictional character that is highly proficient in the English language, but sometimes he uses his mastery of the language in engaging in clownish behavior and consistently making fantastic work of lies. In Mansi, a rare man in his own way, Tayeb Salih weaves a narrative prose about a character that plays in real life the role of a clown. The titular character who also uses his impeccable command of the English language in engaging in deceit and downright bluffing. They call it halbasa. In more than one occasion, the eponymous character uses his mastery of the English language in participating in debates about subjects he knows very little about. For instance, he shows great ignorance in debating with a historian with such a caliber as Professor Arnold Toynbee. Mansi never lacks the company of girls and finds it easy to strike friendship with the likes of Peter Finch, Peter O'Toole, and even the reticent Samuel Beckett. In this Tayeb Salih personal memoir, the titular character also has found a once-in-a-lifetime chance to get nearer to the Queen herself, the superior symbol of the empire. And in that occasion, he had been bold enough to ask her about the upbringing and education of Prince Charles, the present monarch of Great Britain. Tayeb Salih, protagonist in South, Season of Migration to the North, may have impeccable command of the English language, and the eponymous character in his memoir may equally have wit and exceptional mastery of the English tongue. But poor Sudanese peoples, and people like me, are to this day hugely affected by the fragmenting acquisition of English language skills. In effect, they are reduced to low-level readers and sometimes stammers. It is true that some individuals are so excellent in verbal communication, they are dubbed Black Englishmen. But the majority of educated students have effectively become called switchers. That means oscillating between English and Arabic in the construction of even one sentence. They continue to keep wavering between three languages, introducing very few French words. Tayeb Salih himself felt irritated when he saw a banner at Khartoum's airport displaying the French word bienvenue. As a matter of fact, people in Khartoum usually use, obviously through the influence of Egyptians, a number of French words, such as khotwa, ascenseur, plage, instead of pavement, lift, and beach, respectively. If he knew about this fact, the French President Emmanuel Macron would say, "C'est chic." But King Charles would even be a happier bunny to know that Sudanese informal colony still use compound words like over time, weekend, cut out, bye-bye.
Also very much in the scientist. Okay, thank you. It's really very interesting. I'm sure it's Mohammed's presentation will, this thing, just in case, will bring about quite a question for you, and think particularly about the system.
Okay. By the way, the first picture of Tayeb Salih and the musician in profile, that was Bashir Abbas. He's very famous with his whistling and playing the oud.
Yeah.
بشير جلال الأزهري عن أحمد عبد الرحمن.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Yes, and then Jalal and
well, thank you very much indeed. What we do is that we'll have a discussion between the 12 and 12:30, and we hope to stick to our program in terms of time. So you will be asking in case people want to ask you some question later. Okay.